Some places earn their silence, not because nothing happened there, but because the truth buried beneath them is almost impossible to accept. On certain nights, the woods behind an elegant Indiana estate felt strangely empty, as though even wildlife avoided wandering too far inside. Years later, investigators would discover that the quiet wasn't ordinary. It had been protecting secrets no family, neighbor, or visitor ever expected. The first clue wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a body or a desperate witness. It was something small enough to fit inside someone's hand. A pale object rested among fallen leaves, weathered by years of rain and changing seasons, almost blending into the forest floor. Someone looked closer. It wasn't a branch, it wasn't an animal bone, it belonged to a human being. Police expected a brief search, recover the remains, identify the victim, and answer one family's heartbreaking questions before moving forward. Instead, every careful step through the trees uncovered another fragment, then another, until the search stopped feeling anything like routine. Detectives realized they weren't investigating one death. They had entered a place where many stories had ended without anyone noticing. The immediate question wasn't who these people were. It was how so many human remains could disappear without attracting attention for years. Ownership records soon pointed investigators toward an unlikely name, someone whose public life seemed completely incompatible with what lay beneath those trees. Long before police arrived, Fox Hollow Farm had been known as a beautiful countryside estate tucked away in Hamilton County, Indiana. Wide open fields surrounded the property. Dense woodland stretched behind it, creating privacy that many homeowners would have considered a luxury. Nothing about the estate suggested it would one day become one of America's most disturbing crime scenes, attracting investigators from across the country. The man who called Fox Hollow Farm home wasn't living in isolation. He was deeply woven into everyday life around Indianapolis. His name was Herbert Richard Baumeister, though nearly everyone simply knew him as Herb, a businessman with an established reputation in the community. Customers recognized him from his successful Save-A-Lot thrift stores, where affordable furniture and household goods attracted steady streams of loyal shoppers. Outside work, he appeared devoted to family life, sharing the estate with his wife Julie and their 3 children. To neighbors, Fox Hollow Farm looked like the reward for years of professional success, not a place anyone associated with fear or violence. Yet some former employees remembered Herb differently, describing behavior that often seemed unpredictable, unusual, or difficult to understand. Those accounts alone proved nothing. Eccentric personalities exist everywhere, and unusual behavior is not evidence of violent crime. For years, nothing connected Herb Baumeister to the growing number of unanswered disappearances unfolding quietly across central Indiana. Young men began vanishing from Indianapolis, often after evenings spent enjoying the city's nightlife, leaving families searching without clear answers. Some disappeared after visiting popular bars frequented by the local gay community, though investigators initially found no obvious pattern linking every case. Missing person investigations often depend upon time, witnesses, and physical evidence. In these cases, each of those essentials seemed frustratingly scarce. Without bodies, detectives struggled to determine whether crimes had even occurred, or whether unrelated disappearances were being mistaken for something larger. Families refused to stop searching, but years passed with few breakthroughs, allowing uncertainty to settle over every unanswered case. Then investigators began hearing stories about a wealthy man who occasionally met younger men around Indianapolis before driving them somewhere private. At first, those reports sounded too vague to transform an investigation. There were no crime scenes, no confessions, and no direct evidence. Still, as more missing names accumulated and quiet suspicions resurfaced, detectives found themselves looking toward Fox Hollow Farm with growing concern. By the early 1990s, the list of missing men had grown long enough that investigators could no longer dismiss the disappearances as unrelated coincidences. Most of the missing had ordinary lives, ordinary routines, and families who expected them to return home after a night in Indianapolis. Some left behind unfinished plans, others simply vanished, leaving loved ones with questions that grew heavier with every passing month. Despite the similarities, investigators still lacked the one thing capable of tying every disappearance together: a common suspect. Without witnesses placing the missing men in the same location, every investigation seemed to begin and end in isolation. Meanwhile, Herb Baumeister continued running his business, raising his family, and living a life that appeared remarkably ordinary from the outside. Friends, customers, and neighbors saw a successful businessman, not someone whose name would eventually dominate one of Indiana's darkest investigations. Yet behind that carefully maintained public image, Herb's personal life had become increasingly difficult for those closest to him to understand. People who knew him described unpredictable mood changes, unusual habits, and behavior that often left others feeling uncomfortable, though rarely alarmed. None of those observations pointed directly toward murder, but together they painted the portrait of a deeply complicated man. Away from home, another side of Herb's life quietly unfolded in places far removed from his reputation as a family businessman. According to investigators, he spent time around Indianapolis bars known to attract gay men, often introducing himself to strangers. There was nothing criminal about those encounters alone, and nobody meeting Herb would have known they might be taking a dangerous risk. For investigators, the challenge wasn't proving Herb visited those places, it was determining what happened after people left with him. The missing men had vanished without leaving behind crime scenes, making every theory difficult to confirm through physical evidence. Then an account surfaced that immediately caught detectives' attention because, unlike the others, this witness had managed to walk away. The man described meeting an older, well-dressed businessman who invited him to a large estate outside Indianapolis after an evening together. At first, nothing about the invitation seemed unusual. The property appeared peaceful, well-maintained, and far removed from the busy city. But once inside the estate, the atmosphere changed in ways the witness later struggled to forget. He recalled feeling increasingly uneasy as the evening continued, sensing something wasn't right despite seeing no obvious signs of violence. Trusting that instinct, he chose to leave before the situation could escalate, a decision investigators would later consider remarkably significant. Years afterward, when detectives compared his account with other information, certain details began fitting together in unsettling ways. The secluded property he described closely matched Fox Hollow Farm, the same estate now drawing growing investigative attention. One witness alone couldn't solve years of disappearances, but his experience suggested detectives might finally be looking in the right direction. Investigators quietly gathered records, interviewed additional witnesses, and searched for evidence capable of supporting what had once sounded improbable. As they worked, another obstacle remained impossible to ignore. Fox Hollow Farm was private property, protected by law unless probable cause existed. Detectives couldn't simply enter the woods because they had suspicions, no matter how troubling those suspicions had become. Days turned into weeks as investigators assembled every available piece of information, hoping one overlooked detail might justify a closer look. While police built their case, life at Fox Hollow Farm was beginning to change in ways few outsiders fully understood. A decision made within Herb Baumeister's own household would soon give investigators the opportunity they had been patiently waiting for. By 1996, the atmosphere inside Fox Hollow Farm had become increasingly strained, and Herb's marriage was quietly beginning to unravel. Julie Baumeister had spent years trying to make sense of her husband's unusual behavior, though many questions still had no clear answers. Some incidents seemed merely eccentric. Others left her unsettled, hinting that something beneath the surface of family life wasn't quite right. One discovery, however, refused to be easily explained: a human skull found on the property by their young son. When Julie questioned Herb about the unsettling find, he dismissed it as an old medical skeleton from his father's collection. His explanation sounded unusual but not impossible. For the moment, life at Fox Hollow Farm continued as though nothing had happened. Months passed, yet the memory of that skull lingered, becoming harder to ignore as other concerns within the marriage continued to grow. Eventually, Julie decided to leave the estate with their children, creating distance from a home that no longer felt peaceful. Her decision wasn't connected to a murder investigation. At that point, police still had no evidence linking Herb to missing persons. But once the family moved out, the circumstances surrounding Fox Hollow Farm changed in a way investigators had quietly hoped for. Julie contacted authorities, sharing what she remembered about the skull discovered years earlier and the explanation Herb had offered. To detectives, that forgotten incident suddenly carried enormous weight because it aligned with other information already pointing toward the property. Combined with witness accounts and the growing pattern of disappearances, investigators believed they finally had grounds to search the estate. Search warrants were prepared and teams assembled with expectations that remained surprisingly modest given the years of unanswered disappearances. Most investigators believed they might recover a single victim, perhaps enough evidence to reopen one cold case that had long stalled. Nobody involved expected the search to reshape one of Indiana's largest missing person investigations before the day was over. The first officers entered the wooded area behind the house carefully, scanning the uneven ground beneath layers of leaves and fallen branches. Within a short distance, they located what appeared to be another human bone, partially hidden by years of natural growth. Then someone called out from deeper inside the woods after spotting another fragment lying only a few steps away. The discoveries came too quickly to dismiss as isolated remains, forcing investigators to widen the search almost immediately. Soon, evidence markers began appearing throughout the forest, each one representing another fragment of a life waiting to be identified. Experienced detectives understood what they were seeing, but many still struggled to comprehend the extraordinary scale unfolding before them. The remains weren't concentrated in one burial site. They were scattered across large sections of the woodland behind the home. That pattern suggested investigators weren't dealing with a single homicide, but something far larger, far older, and far more disturbing. As forensic teams expanded their search, the number of recovered bones continued climbing far beyond anyone's original expectations. Each new discovery deepened the mystery because investigators still couldn't determine exactly how many individuals were represented among the remains. The quiet estate that neighbors had admired for years was transforming into one of the most complex crime scenes Indiana had ever faced. News of the discovery spread rapidly, drawing additional investigators, forensic specialists, and intense public attention toward Fox Hollow Farm. While search teams worked tirelessly through the woods, detectives turned their attention toward the property's owner, Herb Baumeister. There was only one problem. By the time investigators were ready to question him, Herb Baumeister had already disappeared. Detectives immediately began searching for Herb Baumeister, believing the man who could explain the discoveries was now their highest investigative priority. His disappearance wasn't treated as ordinary travel. The timing raised urgent questions investigators could no longer ignore after what they had uncovered. Family members, business associates, and acquaintances were contacted, but nobody seemed to know exactly where Herb had gone. As the search expanded, forensic teams remained at Fox Hollow Farm, carefully documenting every fragment before disturbing the ground any further. Recovering human remains from such a vast property required extraordinary patience, with every discovery carefully mapped to preserve future evidence. The work unfolded slowly because investigators understood one mistake could permanently erase clues that had survived hidden for many years. Bone fragments appeared beneath leaves, tangled roots, and shallow soil, revealing just how widely the remains had become dispersed. Natural weathering, wildlife, and passing seasons had altered the scene, making reconstruction far more difficult than detectives initially imagined. Forensic anthropologists joined the investigation, helping determine which bones were human and estimating how many victims might be represented. Their findings confirmed investigators' fears. The remains belonged to numerous individuals rather than a single unidentified victim. As laboratories began examining the evidence, detectives searched for connections between the recovered remains and years of missing person reports. Many of those reports involved young men who had disappeared after spending evenings in Indianapolis, though proving each connection required careful forensic work. Some victims could eventually be linked through dental records or personal information, while many others remained heartbreaking mysteries. The investigation now carried two equally important missions: identify the dead and determine exactly who had taken their lives. Meanwhile, officers following Herb's trail learned he had crossed the United States border into Canada several days earlier. That discovery shifted the search dramatically, prompting cooperation between American investigators and Canadian authorities as efforts intensified. The trail ended in Pinery Provincial Park, Ontario, where Herb's vehicle was eventually located parked in a remote area. Nearby, authorities found Herb Baumeister dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound before investigators could question him about Fox Hollow Farm. His death closed the possibility of an arrest, but it answered almost none of the questions surrounding the growing investigation. A suicide note was recovered, yet investigators reported it focused largely on personal and financial struggles rather than the human remains. The note contained no confession, no explanation, and no acknowledgement of the victims whose families were desperately seeking answers. Without testimony from Herb himself, investigators faced the difficult task of rebuilding years of events using only physical evidence. Every recovered bone, every laboratory result, and every witness account suddenly became far more important than anyone had anticipated. Attention also turned toward Herb's movements during the years leading up to the discoveries, searching for overlooked patterns. Investigators concluded that many victims likely encountered Herb around Indianapolis before traveling willingly to Fox Hollow Farm. Exactly what happened after they arrived remains unknown because no surviving eyewitness described the crimes themselves. That absence of direct evidence forced investigators to rely heavily on forensic science rather than speculation or unsupported assumptions. As examinations continued, experts estimated that the recovered remains represented at least 11 individuals, though the true number could be significantly higher. Even with years of painstaking work, countless questions remained unanswered, leaving families suspended between certainty and painful uncertainty. Just when investigators believed they understood the scale of the tragedy, advances in modern DNA science began opening an entirely new chapter. When the investigation began, DNA technology was far less advanced than it is today, limiting what forensic scientists could learn from recovered remains. Many bone fragments had spent years exposed to changing weather, making the preservation of usable genetic material an enormous scientific challenge. Rather than rushing conclusions, investigators carefully stored evidence, believing future technology might answer questions that science couldn't solve at the time. That decision proved remarkably important because forensic science would eventually advance far beyond what investigators imagined during the 1990s. Years later, improved DNA techniques allowed specialists to revisit evidence once considered too damaged to produce meaningful identification. One by one, victims who had remained anonymous for decades slowly began recovering something every family deserves: a name. Each successful identification closed one chapter for grieving relatives, while opening another filled with difficult questions that could never be fully answered. Some families had spent years wondering whether their loved one might still be alive somewhere, holding on to hope despite overwhelming uncertainty. Instead, science confirmed what many had feared while finally ending decades of painful waiting without answers. Investigators continued comparing recovered DNA with missing person records, expanding the search whenever new forensic methods became available. Not every identification happened quickly. Some required years of additional research, genealogy, and cooperation between multiple forensic laboratories. Each breakthrough demonstrated that even decades-old investigations can continue evolving long after the headlines have faded from public attention. Meanwhile, experts returned repeatedly to a troubling question that still has no definitive answer. How many victims were actually buried at Fox Hollow Farm? The scattered condition of the remains made an exact count extraordinarily difficult, leaving investigators cautious about assigning a final number. Most experts believe at least 11 victims were present, though many suspect the true total may never be known with certainty. Without a confession or complete records, investigators relied entirely on physical evidence and documented disappearances to reconstruct what had happened. That absence of direct answers distinguishes the Baumeister investigation from many other serial murder cases solved through admissions of guilt. Instead of hearing the killer explain his actions, investigators were forced to let science speak on behalf of the victims. Every laboratory report, every recovered fragment, and every confirmed identity became another piece of a story Herb Baumeister never told. The investigation also renewed attention toward missing person cases that might once have seemed impossible to solve after so many years. Advances in forensic genealogy encouraged agencies across the country to re-examine evidence from other long-forgotten investigations. Fox Hollow Farm became more than a crime scene. It became an example of how modern science can restore identities once thought permanently lost. Even so, investigators remain careful not to claim certainty where evidence cannot support it, leaving some questions intentionally unanswered. Historical accuracy matters because every unidentified victim represents a real person, not simply another statistic in a criminal investigation. As additional identifications emerged, families finally gained the opportunity to mourn with certainty instead of living beneath endless uncertainty. For investigators who had worked the case for years, each confirmed name represented both progress and a painful reminder of unfinished work. Despite decades of forensic effort, not every family has received the answers they continue hoping for. The woods behind Fox Hollow Farm have yielded many secrets, yet investigators believe they may never reveal every one of them. Today, the case stands as both a remarkable forensic investigation and a sobering reminder that justice sometimes remains painfully incomplete. As the investigation entered its legacy, attention shifted away from the man who owned the property and toward those whose lives were taken far too soon. For years, Herb Baumeister dominated conversations about Fox Hollow Farm, but investigators have always insisted the victims deserve to remain the story's true focus. Each missing person had a family, friends, ambitions, and a future that ended long before anyone understood what had happened. Many relatives spent decades searching for answers, never imagining the truth had been hidden beneath an ordinary stretch of Indiana woodland. Some families have finally received confirmation through modern forensic science, while others continue waiting for news that may never come. That uncertainty remains one of the most heartbreaking parts of this investigation, because unanswered questions did not disappear when Herb Baumeister died. His death ended any possibility of hearing his account, leaving investigators to reconstruct history through evidence rather than explanation. The silence he left behind has become almost as significant as the discoveries made at Fox Hollow Farm itself. Without a confession, investigators cannot fully explain how many victims there were, or the precise sequence of every crime. Even today, researchers continue reviewing historical records, forensic evidence, and missing person files in hopes of uncovering overlooked connections. Every advance in DNA technology offers another opportunity to identify someone whose name was nearly lost to history. Cases like this remind investigators that even decades-old evidence should never be dismissed simply because earlier technology reached its limits. Fox Hollow Farm has become an important example of how forensic science continues working long after a criminal investigation appears finished. It also exposed the challenges investigators faced when disappearances involving marginalized communities received less attention than they deserved. Many advocates believe those early investigative obstacles delayed answers that grieving families had been seeking for years. While evidence cannot rewrite history, it can help reveal patterns that were overlooked when the disappearances first occurred. Today, the property looks remarkably different from the place investigators searched during those difficult weeks in 1996. Visitors passing nearby would likely see peaceful countryside, unaware that one of Indiana's most haunting investigations unfolded beneath those trees. Time has changed the landscape, but it has not erased the significance of what investigators uncovered there. Every recovered bone represented more than evidence. It represented a person whose story deserved to be remembered with dignity. That is why historians, forensic experts, and investigators continue studying this case decades after the headlines first disappeared. Not because of fascination with the killer, but because unanswered questions still hold the possibility of restoring someone's identity. The true legacy of Fox Hollow Farm is measured not by the man who owned it, but by every victim who has finally been named. And for those who remain unidentified, the investigation continues quietly through laboratories, archives, and renewed forensic examination. Some mysteries grow colder with time. This one continues moving forward because science keeps opening doors once thought permanently closed. Perhaps the final chapter of this investigation has not yet been written, even after all these years. Somewhere, another DNA comparison could reconnect a family with answers they have waited decades to receive. Until then, Fox Hollow Farm remains a solemn reminder that the truth can stay hidden for years, yet never remain buried forever. History remembers Herb Baumeister for the horrors linked to his property, but justice is measured by remembering those whose lives were stolen. If this case left you reflecting on the victims, the investigation, or the unanswered questions, we'd love to hear your respectful thoughts below. Subscribe for more carefully researched historical crime documentaries, and let us know which real case you'd like us to investigate next.